Good afternoon, TNS. This is Live Mike joining you with Sven from the UK. Sven, how you doing?
How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing well. Thanks very much. Thanks for joining me. Listen, the last time we spoke, I think it was last Sunday,
Yeah.
we were talking about Alfred the Great. Now, there were a couple things that you wanted to mention that we just didn't have time for, and I just wanted to provide you with an opportunity where you could finish up where you left off, brother. So take her away, Sven. What are we learning today about Alfred the Great?
Okay. Well, I thought maybe we could go back and just have a recap over what I read out last time, just to bring up the points which I thought were pertinent, and then maybe I'll explain a couple of parts of that, and then there was just the last couple of pages of the life of Alfred the Great, and I've found a couple of the laws that he made as well, which I thought people might find interesting. So if I start with a recap, there was the family tree, which went all the way back through Noah to Adam, which I would suggest would be the root of his kingship that gave him that position. So I should imagine he was trying to demonstrate that with this family tree. And then I think actually part of it was one of those members of the family tree. The legend has it that they turned up in a boat as a baby, in a small boat with no sails, no oars, and nobody accompanying them, which is a legend that goes back. I think it was a guy called Geet, the one who the pagans worshipped as a god. But I was wondering if that might be the root of where the tradition of putting people in a boat and pushing them off to say, well, God can look after you, whether that might have been the origin of that happening, because as if to say, well, the reason why he's king is because he's turned up in this boat, and obviously God's looked after him because the boat hasn't been overturned. And if you get a bad king or a bad queen, you could stick them back on the boat and say, well, you told us that God made you king. Well, God can look after you. We're going to push you back out to sea again, which is just something that I thought of recently. But anyway, if we go back to recapping, his father Ethelwulf freed a 10th part of the kingdom from every service and tribute as an everlasting inheritance. So whatever happened to that? The 10th part of the kingdom should never have to pay any tax or any tribute whatsoever.
I think there are many of us out there that would like the sound of that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was an everlasting inheritance. Yeah, for the country. Well, and after he did that, he went away. And whilst he was away, his son Ethelbald and some of the others.
Can I just interrupt? Can I just interrupt you for one moment? I'm sorry. This, as an aside, and this is comedic value. It sounds like J.R.R. Tolkien took some of his names from his book, from this hagiography of Alfred the Great. It's impressive. But anyway. Please continue.
It's interesting that J.R.R. Tolkien said that what he was trying to bring into his books was the mythic values that we had prior to the 10th century, prior to the Norman invasion, and what he was talking about was this time between 870 and 1066 was Alfred the Great's line of kings. And and in 1066 we lost all our myths and what they actually meant, and that's what J.R.R. Tolkien was inspired by, was this actual time. So you're probably right about the names sounding similar.
How about that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, while he was away, his son Ethelbald and others, they plotted to get rid of him, possibly for being decent to his people. He just freed a 10th part of the kingdom. And then there was wicked Queen Edibur, who was kicked out of the country for machinations and trying to bump off the king's friends, and eventually poisoning the king himself. So, it's showing you that there's dodgy people in this family tree as well, quite a few dodgy people. And in Ethelwulf's will, he said that every successor forever after him, for every 10 hides of land in the country, was to feed one man and to keep him sustained with food, drink, and clothing, and that the land should not be waste, but have men and livestock on it. So for every 10 hides of land in the country, a poor man is supposed to be fed and clothed, and the land is supposed to have men and livestock on it. So people are supposed to be able to live on it and keep their cattle and their sheep on it. And if there was no poor natives to be found, then a poor foreigner was to be fed, clothed, and watered. Now, this implies to me that there were times when there were no native poor in the country. Because if there were no native poor in the country, then it would be given to a foreigner. And, if that had never happened, then why would he feel the need to actually put that in? You see, it was the king's responsibility for his people. So there should be no poverty or poor people in the country. Anyway, once he was dead, his son, one of his other sons, one of Alfred's brothers, married his father's wife, to everyone's disgust, which Bishop Asser makes clear that it's to everyone's disgust. And 2.5 years later, he died. And Asher makes a point of saying that there were 2.5 lawless years at that time. And then round about that time, the Vikings arrive, raping, pillaging, murdering, laying waste to everything, doing their infamous blood eagle rites, where they slice open the back, break the ribs, and pull the lungs out. And this was actually done to 2 of the kings further up north of the country, and legend also says that it was done to one of the bishops. So they were pretty frightening people that he was fighting against, and there was numerous battles all over the country. Excuse me. And
Sure.
A bit about then he diverges into some more description about Alfred himself, and he says that he desires wisdom more than anything else. More than anything else, he wishes to learn the liberal arts and to have his people educated. Now, the liberal arts, basically, I got this from Wikipedia, were those qualities that distinguished a free man from a slave or resident alien. The aim of the studies was to produce a virtuous, knowledgeable, and articulate person able to take part in public debate, defend oneself in court, serve on juries, and do military service. And in Greece, freeborn girls were just as likely to have a formal education as boys. And especially in the Roman Empire. That comes from liber, which is Latin for free. And the slaves would have purely manual technical skills. And these liberal arts were made up of grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, astrology. Excuse me. So Alfred desired to learn the liberal arts and to educate his people with them. So whilst he was in Rome when he was 4 years old, he must have been struck by how things were there. And then when he came back to England and there was no teachers there and nobody could read, and he must have just wanted it to be as good for his people as he'd seen it in Rome, and he would have had quite a cushioned life of it when he was in Rome. So I imagine that played quite an influence on him. I mean, it shows you that it can't have been all bad there if it was that influence that inspired him. And one of the quotes is that there were no good scholars in the kingdom at the time. It's in Bishop Asser's life of King Alfred. Some of the places that the Vikings took over, they installed puppet rulers, the same as what goes on today. After virtually annihilating the Christians, they would install a puppet ruler. And it's interesting that they were actually, the British people were actually called the Christians. They weren't actually called the English. They were called the Christians. And I found a couple of quotes that point this out. Eusebius, who was writing in 290 AD, and this is a quote of his: "The apostles passed beyond the ocean to the isles called the Britannic Isles." So that's talking about the apostles. That's talking, right back at, sort of 36 AD. Gildas, the 6th century monk, this is a quote of his: Meanwhile, these islands received as beams of light, that is, the holy precepts of Christ, the true Son, at the latter part, as we know, of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Now, Tiberius Caesar reigned at Christ's crucifixion, and as we know, indicates that this was common knowledge in his day. So in the 6th century, it was common knowledge that Christianity had come to Britain shortly after Christ was crucified. And there's a chap called Sibelius also states, Christianity was privately confessed elsewhere, but the first nation that proclaimed it as their religion was Britain. And Archbishop Usher, he wrote that the British National Church was founded in AD 36, 160 years before heathen Rome confessed Christianity. So the English people were originally known as the Christians, and that's why in the life of Asa, instead of referring to the English, occasionally refers to the Anglo-Saxons, but he basically frames it as the Christians against the Vikings. Oh, I've got another one here as well. Chrysostom, Patriarch of Constantinople, AD 347 to 407. The British Isles, which are beyond the sea and which lie in the ocean, the Atlantic, have received the virtue of the word. Though thou shouldst go to the ocean, to the British Isles, there thou shouldst hear all men everywhere discussing matters out of the Scriptures, with another voice indeed, but not with another faith, with a different tongue, but the same judgment. And that was Constantinople, which is where King Alfred was in correspondence with the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and if they had anything that they couldn't decide upon from the courts, they would refer it to Constantinople. It was Byzantine Christianity, not Roman Christianity, and the Pope at the time wasn't the head of the church; he was just another member of the church. So that's it points to England being Anglo-Orthodox, not Roman Catholic, as a lot of people seem to think. Anyway, I'll go back to my notes here. They were a very devout family, apart from Ethelbald, his brother that bedded his father's wife. Ethelred, his other brother, refuses to actually leave for battle until he's finished saying Mass. In fact, the battle's actually started, and he's still in his tent saying Mass. And they did actually win that battle, and Asa points out that it was through his devout worship that they won the battle. And eventually, all the other kings in England either die or they flee to Europe, which is what Alfred could have done at any time. And then he's living in hiding in the marshlands of Somerset, and he's foraging for his food, and occasionally he's raiding the traitors that have sided with the Vikings, the collaborators, I suppose, not traitors, collaborators, because they didn't have much choice. And rumours of his demise or his flight are everywhere. But he suddenly appears at Easter at Egbert Stone, which gives much inspiration to the inhabitants of Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire that are gathered there. And now it's death or glory, so they all get together really inspired, and they make a stand against the Vikings, and they go and camp right in front of the Vikings' gates. After 2 weeks, the Vikings, terrified and hungry, agree to peace. And somehow, it doesn't stipulate exactly how, Alfred manages to convert the Viking king Guthrum to Christianity. And Guthrum receives baptism at Alfred's hand, and he becomes Alfred's adopted son in a ceremony which is still the same in the Orthodox Church today, with the unbinding of the chrism on the 8th day, which is an Orthodox sacrament. And the king gives him and his men many treasures whilst they stay.
Can I